Before foreign religions carried their scriptures across the seas, and long before colonial maps redrew the borders of the continent, Africa already possessed one of the most intricate spiritual systems ever developed by human civilization. Not a single belief, not a unified doctrine, but thousands of localized cosmologies, each shaped by geography, ecology, and ancestral memory. Across the continent, spiritual knowledge did not emerge from abstraction. It arose from land, weather, survival, and social order. Divinity was not imagined as distant or invisible. It was encountered through rivers, storms, fire, forests, disease, fertility, dreams, and death itself. In African worldviews, gods were not separate from life. They were embedded within it. Spiritual forces governed rainfall, harvest cycles, birth rituals, legal judgments, warfare, healing practices, and political authority. To understand the world was to understand how unseen forces shaped visible reality. This knowledge was transmitted orally through praise poetry, proverbs, ritual specialists, architecture, and ceremonial performance. There were no sacred books in the modern sense. There were sacred landscapes, sacred lineages, sacred rhythms preserved through memory rather than text. Long before Greek philosophers theorized metaphysics, African societies had already constructed complex systems describing the relationship between material existence and invisible order. And contrary to colonial mythology, Africa was never a spiritual void waiting to be filled. It was one of the earliest laboratories of metaphysical thought on Earth. In West Africa, spiritual systems developed around the idea that divine forces live among humans rather than above them. Among the Yoruba civilization, stretching across modern Nigeria, Benin, and Togo, reality is structured through a layered cosmology. At the highest level exists Olodumare, the ultimate creative intelligence, not worshipped directly but recognized as the source of all existence. Below this source operate hundreds of Orisha, divine forces governing specific aspects of reality: thunder, iron, fertility, rivers, disease, justice, creativity, destiny. These are not symbolic characters. They are understood as living intelligences with preferences, temperaments, and domains of influence. Shango governs lightning and moral authority. Ogun governs iron, technology, and warfare. Osun governs fertility, beauty, diplomacy, and healing. Obatala governs form, ethics, and human consciousness. Each Orisha is associated with natural elements, specific colors, rhythms, foods, sacred numbers, and geographical locations. Their worship involves possession rituals, drumming, dance, trance states, and divination systems such as Ifa, one of the most sophisticated philosophical systems ever created, using mathematical patterns to interpret destiny and moral alignment. This is not folklore. It is an epistemology, a system for understanding reality. Vodun, the science of spiritual pathways. West of Yoruba territory, the Fon and Yu civilizations of Benin and Togo developed Vodun, a parallel spiritual system later misrepresented globally as voodoo. In Vodun cosmology, the universe operates through interconnected forces that flow between visible and invisible realms. At the center stands Mawulisa, a dual creative principle representing balance between feminine and masculine, moon and sun, night and day. Spiritual access occurs through Legba, the gatekeeper force. Without Legba, communication with any spiritual dimension is impossible. Other forces include Sakpata, governing disease, healing, and soil fertility; Hivioso, governing thunder, justice, and retribution; Dan, the cosmic serpent, symbolizing continuity and time. Vodun temples are not symbolic buildings. They are considered residences of living forces. Priests and priestesses are trained specialists responsible for maintaining energetic balance between community and environment. Here, spirituality is not belief. It is management of invisible systems. Among the Akan peoples of Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, spiritual order is structured around Nyame, the supreme sky intelligence. But Nyame does not govern daily affairs. That responsibility belongs to the Abosom, forces associated with rivers, forests, mountains, fertility, warfare, and justice. Most important among them is Asase Ya, the earth itself. Asase Ya is not metaphor. She is considered the moral authority of society. Crimes are not only legal violations, they are ecological ruptures, murder, incest, corruption, land abuse. These are believed to disturb the earth's balance and require ritual restoration, not just punishment. Here, morality is not abstract, it is geological. Among Mande civilizations, Mandinka, Bambara, Malinka, spiritual reality is governed by Nyama, a universal energetic force present in all beings. Nyama, a universal energetic force present in all beings. Nyama is not a god, it is power itself. Speech, music, ritual, and craftsmanship are methods for directing Nyama. To misuse it causes illness, madness, or social collapse. Griots, Jili, and marabouts are not entertainers or priests. They are energy regulators maintaining equilibrium between past and present, ancestors and living. Here, sound itself is considered a technology. In Igbo cosmology, existence flows from Chukwu, the supreme creative intelligence, but ethical authority belongs to Allah, the earth principle. Allah governs fertility, law, burial, agriculture, moral consequence. To violate ethical codes is not merely sin, it is an offense against the land itself. This is why Igbo spirituality places such importance on land rituals, reconciliation ceremonies, and ancestral memory. The earth remembers. Across all these systems, a unified pattern emerges. Divinity is local. Nature is intelligent. Morality is ecological. Reality is relational. Gods are not remote, they are neighbors. Spiritual knowledge is not separated from agriculture, medicine, governance, architecture, or law. It is the operating system of civilization itself, and this structure did not vanish. It went underground, it adapted, it survived inside languages, rhythms, healing practices, oral history, festivals, and ancestral rites that persist today, not as myth, but as memory. Before foreign religions arrived with written doctrines and imported cosmologies, the societies of the Nile Valley and the Horn of Africa had already built spiritual systems in which political authority, natural law, and sacred power were inseparable. In the ancient Kushite world, queens known as Kandakis did not rule as ceremonial figures. They commanded armies, presided over religious rites, and embodied divine legitimacy. In Kush, power was not structured around male dominance alone. Sacred authority flowed through lineage, ritual competence, and cosmic alignment, allowing women to occupy the highest spiritual and political positions without contradiction. As the trade routes of the Red Sea expanded eastward, another civilization emerged with equal sophistication, Axum, located in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Long before its Christian conversion in the 4th century CE, Axum functioned as a major commercial and religious center connecting Africa to Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean. Its rulers minted their own coins, built monumental stone obelisks, and maintained a priestly system grounded in celestial observation and royal sacrality. Pre-Christian Axumite religion was deeply embedded in cosmology. Kings were seen not simply as political rulers, but as mediators between sky, land, and people. Inscriptions carved into stone reveal the worship of deities associated with sea, war, kingship, and planetary cycles, indicating that astronomy played a central role in religious life. Axumite temples were aligned with solar movement, and royal inscriptions invoked divine favor not through blind devotion, but through public acts of sacrifice, ritual law, and ethical rule. In this region, nature itself functioned as sacred architecture. Mountains served as sanctuaries, rivers marked spiritual boundaries, caves and highlands were regarded as portals between human consciousness and cosmic order. Religious authority was inseparable from geography. To govern the land was to maintain balance with invisible forces embedded within it. Among the peoples of the Horn, spiritual influence did not descend from fixed priesthoods alone. It moved through dreams, spirit possession, trance, and oral transmission. Certain individuals were recognized as intermediaries capable of interpreting symbolic visions, diagnosing spiritual imbalance, and restoring harmony through sound, rhythm, and communal ritual. One of the most enduring spiritual traditions of this region involved the Zar phenomenon, a system of spirit mediation found across Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, and Somalia. These spirits were not abstract metaphors. They were believed to manifest through physical symptoms, emotional disturbances, or altered states of consciousness. Healing did not involve exorcism in the modern sense, but negotiation, music, incense, chanting, and social reintegration were used to re-establish balance between the individual and the unseen realm. In Somali cosmology, long before Islamic influence, the sky itself was regarded as a divine authority. Oral poetry preserves memory of Wak, a celestial creator associated with rain, justice, fertility, and moral order. Wak was not confined to temples. Sacred wells, high places, and ancestral trees functioned as sites of communion. The divine was not approached through architecture, but through alignment with natural forces. This belief in a supreme sky presence extends across East Africa and appears among Cushitic, Nilotic, and Rift Valley cultures, forming one of the oldest known African spiritual archetypes. The remote creator deity who establishes cosmic order then withdraws, leaving humans responsible for maintaining balance through ethical conduct and ancestral continuity. As these traditions evolved, they did not disappear with the arrival of Christianity or Islam. Instead, they submerged into new forms. Ethiopian Christianity preserved ancient patterns through pilgrimage to sacred springs, veneration of saints at mountain shrines, and ritual fasting tied to agricultural cycles. Beneath formal theology remained the same elemental logic. Land remembers, spirits observe, and ancestors continue to participate in human affairs. Moving southward into Central and Southern Africa, spiritual systems become even more relational. Here, the divine does not reign from distant heavens. It exists within lineage, breath, memory, and soil. Among the Zulu, creation begins not with a cosmic explosion, but with emergence from primordial reeds. Life unfolds from the earth itself. The supreme force, Unkulunkulu, is acknowledged as origin, but daily spiritual life centers on the Amadlozi, ancestral presences who actively intervene in community affairs. These ancestors are not worshipped as gods. They are consulted as elders who never died. Misfortune is interpreted not as random suffering, but as broken communication between generations. Healing involves ritual acknowledgement, ethical correction, and reintegration into communal harmony. Further north, among the Dinka of South Sudan, divinity is expressed through cattle. Their supreme deity, Nyalik, is distant and vast, yet spiritual life revolves around living symbols, cows that carry songs, names, genealogies, and ritual identity. To lose cattle is not only economic loss, it is spiritual rupture. The cow becomes theology in motion, linking humans, land, and sky through living breath. In the Congo cosmological system, the universe is visualized as a circular field of transformation governed by balance between visible and invisible realms. Time is not linear, it is cyclical. Life moves through phases of emergence, growth, decline, and return. Death is not absence, it is relocation of consciousness. The Congo cosmogram represents this worldview mathematically, a sacred cross marking the 4 stages of existence. Dawn symbolizes birth, noon represents life, sunset marks death, midnight signifies ancestral return. The living and the dead occupy different states of the same continuum. Among the Lozi peoples of the Zambezi Basin, creation begins with the deity Nyambi, who withdraws from humanity after witnessing human violence. This withdrawal is not abandonment, it is philosophical. Humans must govern themselves. Divine power no longer enforces morality, it observes. Kings become mediators. Ritual becomes responsibility. Ethics becomes survival. The annual Kwamboka ceremony, where the Lozi king relocates across floodwaters, is not merely cultural performance. It reenacts cosmic migration, movement from danger to stability, from chaos to order, from imbalance to restoration. Across these regions, one pattern remains consistent. The divine does not rule through fear. It operates through relationship, through memory, through land, through breath, through ancestral continuity. Spiritual authority is not imposed. It is inherited through ethical alignment. The gods withdraw, not because they are weak, but because humans are meant to become responsible stewards of balance. And as these systems extend further south into the oldest living cosmologies on Earth, among the San peoples of the Kalahari, the divine dissolves entirely into environment itself. Here, there is no central deity. Reality is animated. Every animal carries meaning. Every landscape holds consciousness. Healing occurs through trance, dance, breath, and altered perception. The world itself becomes scripture. The body becomes temple, and memory becomes law. Across the southern deserts, where rainfall is rare and the horizon stretches without interruption, the oldest living cultures on the continent developed a spiritual language shaped by survival itself. Among the San peoples of the Kalahari, existence was never divided into sacred and ordinary. The land was teacher, healer, archive, and witness. Their cosmology centered not on temples or priesthoods, but on direct engagement with invisible forces through the body. Central to this worldview was the healing trance. Community gatherings were not entertainment, but physiological and spiritual technologies. Through rhythmic clapping, chanting, and circular dance, selected individuals entered altered neurological states that modern science now associates with endorphin release and deep limbic activation. In these states, healers reported sensations of internal heat, trembling, and visual phenomena, what the San described as spiritual energy rising through the spine. Illness was not treated as isolated malfunction, but as imbalance within the social and environmental field. This same pattern appears across much of sub-Saharan Africa. Among Bantu-speaking societies stretching from the Congo Basin to the Cape, the universe was structured around layered realities: the visible world of humans, the invisible realm of spirits, and the ancestral dimension that mediated between the two. Supreme creator figures existed, but were rarely the focus of daily religious life. Instead, attention centered on intermediary forces, ancestors, nature spirits, and specialized human mediators. Diviners, healers, and ritual specialists functioned as diagnosticians of social and spiritual health. Their methods were empirical within their own systems: dream interpretation, trance, herbal pharmacology, symbolic mapping of symptoms, and behavioral analysis of community relationships. Illness was interpreted as communicative signal rather than biological accident. Infertility, mental distress, or repeated misfortune indicated unresolved relational rupture, either with living kin, the dead, or the land itself. Across Central Africa, ancestor veneration formed the core of moral law. The deceased were not removed from society. They were redistributed into a parallel sphere of influence. Elders were remembered not for sentiment, but for jurisdiction. They were consulted before major decisions, invoked in legal disputes, and honored through regular ritual maintenance. To neglect ancestral obligation was to invite systemic instability. Time itself was understood as cyclical. Birth, death, and rebirth were movements within a continuous field of existence rather than linear progression. This ontology shaped everything from agricultural calendars to funeral practices. Burial was not separation, but reintegration into the collective memory of the land. When external religions arrived, these systems were not erased by theological argument alone. They were disrupted by structural power. Missionary activity was inseparable from colonial administration. Conversion often coincided with forced schooling, land seizure, legal reform, and criminalization of indigenous practices. African spiritual systems were reframed as obstacles to modernization, labeled as witchcraft, fetishism, or moral deficiency. Sacred forests were cut down. Ritual specialists were imprisoned. Public ceremonies were outlawed. Children were punished for speaking ritual languages or participating in ancestral rites. Spiritual suppression became part of state policy, yet these systems did not collapse. They adapted. Under pressure, African religions reorganized themselves beneath dominant frameworks. What could not be practiced openly moved into domestic spaces, coded language, or symbolic disguise. This adaptive strategy later became visible in the diaspora. During the transatlantic slave trade, African cosmologies crossed the ocean without physical artifacts. They survived through memory, rhythm, oral transmission, and embodied ritual. In the Americas, enslaved Africans reconstructed spiritual systems using available materials and imposed religious structures. In Haiti, West and Central African traditions merged with Catholic iconography, producing Vodou. African deities were mapped onto Christian saints not as replacements but as camouflage. Loa retained African functions, possession, healing, moral arbitration, and ancestral mediation. In Brazil, Candomblé preserved Yoruba cosmology through dance, drumming, and liturgical language. The Orisha remained intact beneath Portuguese Catholic imagery. In Cuba, Santeria encoded divine forces within church symbolism while maintaining ritual continuity through initiation, trance, and sacrifice. These were not hybrid religions created by choice. They were survival technologies. Back on the continent, similar transformations occurred. In response to missionary dominance, African independent churches emerged, blending Christian scripture with indigenous cosmology. Prophecy, healing, spirit possession, sacred water, and ritual music re-entered religious life under new names. The Aladura movements in Nigeria, the Zionist churches of southern Africa, and the Kimbanguist tradition in the Congo all reflect this pattern. External theology layered over internal continuity. Even within formal conversion, ancestral logic persisted. People might attend church on Sunday but consult diviners in private. A doctor might prescribe medicine, but elders would still assess spiritual causation. Crisis revealed the depth of continuity. Death remained relational. The dead were not gone. They remained accountable. Dreams still carried messages. Names still held power. Land still remembered. What colonial systems failed to understand was that African spirituality was not based on doctrine. It was based on relational intelligence. It could not be destroyed by banning texts or burning shrines because it was not stored in books or buildings. It was stored in bodies, rhythms, landscapes, and kinship structures. Today, across the continent and the diaspora, these systems are not simply being revived as heritage. They are being re-examined as coherent philosophical frameworks. Modern anthropology, neuroscience, and ecology increasingly recognize the empirical logic embedded within these traditions. Communal regulation of stress, symbolic mediation of trauma, environmental ethics, and psychosocial integration. What was once dismissed as superstition is now understood as a distributed system of knowledge built over millennia of observation, adaptation, and lived experience. African spirituality did not disappear. It reorganized itself across time, geography, and power structures. It learned to speak in new languages without forgetting its original grammar. And beneath every imposed theology, every colonial institution, every imported doctrine, the same foundational structure remained intact. The world is alive. Nothing is isolated. The dead are present. The land remembers. The spirit responds. Across the continent and throughout the global African diaspora, a quiet transformation is unfolding. Communities once taught to forget are now choosing to remember. Names that were once whispered in secrecy are being spoken aloud again. Spiritual lineages that survived in fragments are being reassembled through research, language revival, oral history, and cultural education. Young Africans are studying ancestral systems that colonial schools erased. Scholars are translating indigenous cosmologies preserved in oral memory and early inscriptions. Artists are reintroducing sacred symbols into modern music, fashion, film, and literature. digital platforms have become unexpected temples, spaces where spiritual teachers, historians, and cultural archivists share knowledge that once lived only in village circles. This movement is not nostalgia. It is continuity, not rebellion against modern life, but reintegration with something older than it. Colonial power attempted to dismantle African spirituality by controlling education, religion, and law. But what it could not eliminate was memory itself. Spiritual systems that once governed kingdoms and villages did not vanish. They adapted, fragmented, traveled, and waited. Like seeds buried beneath concrete, they endured. Today, these traditions are resurfacing not as relics, but as living philosophies. In the rediscovery of Chukwu among the Igbo, of Nzambi in Central Africa, of Oshun and Shango in Yoruba lands, of Niame among the Akan, and of ancestral systems across the Horn and Southern Africa, a continental pattern becomes clear. African spirituality was never erased. It was reorganized under pressure. To forget a god is not simply to lose a name. It is to lose a way of interpreting the world. To walk past a river without knowing it carries memory. To look at the stars without recognizing them as maps. To bury the dead without rituals that reconnect them to life. Colonization did not only conquer territory, it disrupted relationships between humans, land, and spirit. Sacred mountains became administrative zones. Ancestral shrines became mission compounds. Drums were labeled noise. Dreams were labeled superstition. Spiritual authority was replaced by imported doctrine. But spiritual systems rooted in land and body cannot be permanently suppressed. They retreat, camouflage, hybridize, and return. Across Africa and the diaspora, old cosmologies survived inside songs, naming systems, healing rituals, festivals, and family memory. In the Caribbean, African deities lived behind Catholic saints. In Brazil and Cuba, ritual dance preserved Yoruba cosmology. In African independent churches, prophecy and healing re-emerged through indigenous logic disguised in Christian language. In villages, elders continued to consult spirits even as churches rose beside ancestral groves. What is returning now is not simply a list of old gods. It is a worldview where spirit is not distant, nature is not inert, ancestors are not gone, land is not property, and human life is not isolated from the universe. African spiritual systems were never empty traditions. They were integrated knowledge systems that regulated agriculture, medicine, law, social ethics, psychology, and environmental responsibility. They answered the same questions modern science still asks about balance, disorder, death, memory, and human behavior through different methodologies. They were not based on blind belief, they were based on relationship. And today, as Africa navigates globalization, migration, technological change, and shifting identities, remembering these systems is not regression, it is grounding, it is restoration. It is the recovery of intellectual and spiritual authorship over a history that was interrupted, fragmented, and misrepresented, but never destroyed. The temples may stand in ruins, but the rivers still flow. The wind still carries names. The soil still remembers footsteps. The drums still speak across generations. The dreams still arrive unannounced, and within those rhythms, something ancient is still listening. Not demanding worship, but inviting understanding, not asking for obedience, but offering memory, not calling us backward, but reminding us where we began, because African identity did not originate in chains, conquest, or conversion. It began in cosmologies older than empires, in philosophies shaped by stars, seasons, ancestors, and land, in systems that taught humans not to dominate the world, but to negotiate with it. To listen before acting, to remember before building, to belong before owning. These traditions did not disappear. They adapted. They went quiet. They waited. They survived inside language, gesture, ritual, and story, until a generation ready to ask deeper questions finally arrived. So if this journey challenged what you thought you knew about African history, if it unsettled inherited narratives about science, religion, or civilization, if it stirred questions about identity, memory, or belonging, if it made you curious about the knowledge your ancestors carried long before textbooks existed, then subscribe to this channel for more untold histories where Africa's past meets the world's future. And let me ask you this: which part of African history do you feel deserves more attention? And why? Because the real rediscovery is not just of gods, it is of ourselves.